Welcome to Turning 21. And today's guest is, I think, familiar to most all of you, is Bill Sheldon. He's been an advocate at the community level in Somerville for many years and an authority on various matters important to the community and city government and development. And we thought this would be a great time to ask Bill to join us, share his thoughts. Mr. Sheldon.
Okay, well, first of all, if you want to see the presentation without the big void in the upper right-hand or the right-hand corner or the right-hand side, you can go up and choose to collapse those photos, so the boxes. I apologize, I don't have the correct technical term for these. Otherwise, I'll just get into the presentation. Actually, before I do, I want to say I'm really flattered to be invited by the Chamber. I have enormous respect for this organization. I don't think many people in Somerville understand how much the Chamber really contributes to making Somerville a better place to live and work. And I truthfully don't understand I don't think many people understand how the Chamber's members really shape the fabric of the community. How businesses, and particularly small businesses, contribute to amenities, contribute to culture, and really improve our lives. So again, I'm flattered to be speaking here. I want to talk today about thinking about our city as a system. Our planet, our universe, most complex human creations are systems, but we are never really taught how to think about them as systems. Our schools are divided into subjects. When we go into work, we perform functions, and we work in organizations that are often referred to as silos. But the world more approximates a system. And probably the first person who really tried to think about this effectively on the societal level was Karl Marx, but he did it after decades of accumulating evidence and analyzing it. And towards the end of his career, he declared himself not to be a Marxist. And the reason why he wasn't a Marxist is because many of his followers who proclaim themselves to be, instead of using and improving on his methodology, took his conclusions as dogma while history was still continuing and changing. And frankly, that has a certain relevance to local politics in Somerville today. Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, Vilfredo Pareto kind of were thinkers whose systems thinking were a little more acceptable to the powers that be, and they, with Marx, kind of were the progenitors of sociology. After World War II, engineers began to develop systems theory for analyzing complex systems. And a sociologist named Talcott Parsons developed a systems theory of society, which was a little less threatening. And he used an analogy, which I want to share with you, which I think is useful for this presentation. He suggested that we think of systems as a chessboard in which all the pieces are connected by rubber bands. So you can't move one piece without having some effect on all the others. And I think that refers a lot that if we try and think about Somerville as a system, that's useful. But I want to say Somerville is a system that is both nested within larger systems and has subsystems within it. kind of like those Russian Petrushka dolls or Chinese boxes where we're the middle box. And because it's hard to conceptualize a system in whole, because we think linearly, I thought that I would pick one thread with which to try and, if we follow that thread, look at how that particular chess piece is connected with all the others in the city, and how we can't do anything without affecting everything. And that the housing housing affordability has probably been the most potent issue in the last couple of elections. And it's probably affected all of us who've lived here for a long time, because most of us can't count the number of people we love who have been priced out of the city. And very often those people were the people who wove the fabric of community, who contributed to the city, who coached Little League, who looked in on elder neighbors, who participated in voluntary organizations, and they're gone. And so I thought we would follow that thread, and I'm not going to read these bullet points, but Somerville, probably more than any other city in Massachusetts, has really struggled to do something about preserving or expanding affordability, and we're still fighting a losing battle. And the reason why is, this graph will show you that even though we've in many ways tried harder than cities surrounding us, they still have a greater proportion of their housing units that are either permanently affordable because of deed restrictions, or affordable for at least 30 years because of contracts. And the reason why is simply because, the primary reason why is simply because those cities have more money than we do. Even though Cambridge's per capita income is only 2/3 that of Somerville's, it still spends a great deal more per resident than we do, and that we can't. And free cash per resident, free cash is a kind of imperfect way of comparing different municipalities' strengths, but it is indicative. Free cash, also called unassigned funds, is the amount of money that a city has to deal with emergencies or unanticipated needs or unanticipated opportunities. And you can see from that graph the difference between us and Boston, which has 5 times the amount of free cash that Somerville does per resident, and Cambridge that has 11 times that amount. And the reason why they have more money is because they have more commercial development. To give you an indication about why that's important, our Somerville's residential tax rate is only 62% that of commercial, but residential creates twice the municipal costs. So that's why Somerville has a structural fiscal deficit. The only way that we can pay our bills is because we receive state aid. And in 2002, some of us will remember that when the state caught cold, Somerville caught pneumonia, and we had mass layoffs. The reason why, again, is because only 18% of our tax base is commercial. And so you can see the comparisons between the tax revenues per capita that we receive from commercial versus those that residents in Boston and Cambridge receive. And what happens then is that Boston and Cambridge employ our residents, and because of these economics, they make a lot of money on the places where our residents work, whereas we house their employees. Now, the most recent census data we have on where Somerville residents work is 2015. But as you can see, 50, almost 52% of Somerville residents work in Boston and Cambridge. And 85% of Somerville residents work outside the city. Only 15% of the people who live here who have jobs and work in Somerville. So we lose money on the residential properties that house the workers that work in the buildings that generate the revenues that Boston and Cambridge have to pay the city services that we would like to be able to pay for. And the only study that's ever been done in the city on the fiscal impacts of land uses was done, I think, 4 years ago by Tischler Weiss. And these are the results, and they bear a little more explanation. But what you see here, kind of going from left to right, is that for what they call neighborhood residential, which is most of the housing units in Somerville, city loses about $840 a year per unit. For what they call mixed use residential, the city has a slight gain of about $337 a year. But, what the mixed use residential are the kind of new units that are being built in Assembly Square and that are proposed in Union Square. And if you want to know what the difference is between neighborhood residential and mixed use residential in terms of expenses and revenues, the difference is the neighborhood residential assumes 1 child per unit, and mixed use residential assumes 1 child for 12 units. So we have a choice between either losing money or excluding children from our community. And without consciously thinking about it, as we'll see a little later in the presentation, we've chosen the latter increasingly. And part of that, and this is a bit of a diversion, but part of that is because working adults, generally aged 24 through 40, are coming together to rent units, and which in turn prices the units out of the reach of families. Retail, has a little bigger gain. Office has a substantially bigger gain. Now, when Carson Bice did this study, he did not include lab space. But if we were going to put a bar in there for lab space, it would conservatively be about $5,000 per year per 1,000 square feet net gain. And the reason for that is both because lab space is not only more expensive to build, but the equipment in it is taxable as personal property. So for a city, having biotech labs is quite lucrative. The hotel room number is a little misleading. It is high because of excise taxes that count, room tax and meal tax, but it is also quite volatile. So this is kind of this bar is kind of what it would look like in its better years. I lost my place here, so why don't I just move on to the next slide? Well, let me just say a couple other things. This is also a little misleading, just a little bit, because of the assumptions that the city insisted that Carson Bice work into his analysis. And one of the assumptions, for example, is to use incremental costs rather than average costs. Incremental costs understate the true cost. Average costs would have overstated the true cost. The truth is probably in the middle. A second reason is because he was told not to assume any new buildings being built. For example, the high school or the police station. So if we were going to kind of layer in the more accurate assumptions, probably every bar would be a little shorter here, but the relationship between the bars would probably be pretty close. Moving on. So the result of this is that Somerville has fewer jobs. You know, Cambridge has almost 4 times the number of jobs per working residents than we do. You know, Boston, not quite as much, but, you know, let's say 3 times. And not only that, but the wages that Somerville jobs pay is substantially lower than wages that are paid in our 2 largest neighbors. And the reason why is again, because the jobs that, well, we'll get to that in a minute. Well, let's get to it right now. Because the jobs that we have here are concentrated in the lower wage sectors. So if you look at kind of the left hand, these industry sectors are ordered left to right from the lowest paid to the highest paid. So the lowest paid is what the people who work in our restaurants and hotels. And the highest paid are people who work in, you know, engineering, architecture, consulting, so on. And you will notice that as you move left to right, we tend to have the highest proportion of jobs in the lowest paid categories. And then as you move towards the right, the highest paid categories are in Boston and in Somerville. I mean, Boston and Cambridge. The very often outliers are things that if you investigate them, they tell you more about the system. So education and health services, where the highest bars are a bit of an analogy of an anomaly. And the reason for that is because a lot of that in that blue bar is Tufts University. And a lot of Tufts University's employees don't work in Somerville, even though Tufts has substantial facilities in Boston, where its medical and dental centers are. But many of those employees, not all, but many of those employees still get counted as working in Somerville for purposes of the state Executive Office of Employment and Workforce Development, which maintain these figures. And the reason why the jobs are distributed in this way is because we don't have any place to put them. Or at least historically, we have not had a place to put them. So going back to the thread, the rubber band that was housing, and following it to another rubber band to open space, we have the second lowest proportion of open space in the Commonwealth, both as a percentage of total land area and also as a per 1,000 residents. And what happens, and that historically was because Somerville, the way Somerville became Somerville, frankly, was most of our leaders were developers. I mean, and I'm talking going back 150 years. Most of the elected leaders were developers. That's why we got in fact, Bill White likes to point out that Prospect Hill Park was resisted by the city's leaders. And the reason why that it was created to commemorate the raising of the first American flag on Prospect Hill is because a number of women who couldn't vote went door to door and got subscriptions for the park. And that became a kind of, and thus developed a kind of political momentum, which thankfully is why we have Prospect Hill Park, which when I look out my, just above my computer here, I can see. So thank you, women of the turn of the century. And housing also absorbs the land that we need for commercial development and for open space and commercial development that can pay for the open space. So as a lot of you know, Somerville is the densest city in the Commonwealth. These are the inner core cities. And there has been, I don't know quite how to say this. There's been a political demand in recent years for more housing, on the notion that if we increase supply and demand, we will lower prices here. In fact, there is no amount of how, even if we covered every square yard of Somerville that's left in new housing, we could not equilibrate price and demand at a lower price point, because the housing crisis is regional, it's not local. And we can't build a Chinese wall around Somerville. About, I don't remember how long ago, something like, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 years ago, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, recognizing the regional housing crisis, came up with recommendations on how many housing units each municipality within its 101 municipalities should build. And the number in Somerville was something like around 6,000. And the city administration at the time said, no, we need 9,000. And what no one seemed to recognize or examine was the methodology that the MAPC had used for those recommendations. And the methodology was they applied the same percentage to every single municipality. So the densest cities and towns remained the densest cities and towns, and relatively the least dense got no more dense. And this is an example of linear thinking as opposed to systems thinking. Well, one of the outcomes of that has to do, one of the city's big priorities has been making the city more resilient in response to climate change, making it more sustainable. And we've actually done quite a good job in terms of, we have either the highest or the second highest percentage in the nation of people who commute to work using bikes. And I take that back. In the Commonwealth, we have I'm going to start over again. We have the highest percentage of people in the Commonwealth who use transit or bikes to get to work. Nevertheless, the number of registered vehicles and therefore traffic and congestion keep going up and up and up. And the reason for that is because we keep building more housing units that are inhabited by, we keep building more what HUD calls unaffordable housing units, which are inhabited by more affluent people who have more cars. And as prices on existing housing go up and up, more affluent people with cars displace less affluent people who don't have cars. And one of the other outcomes of these processes that I've been talking about is the unraveling of our community. And we don't have a really good, sociology hasn't given us many really good quantitative measures to measure community. But we do know that participation in voluntary organizations, involvement in the political life of the city, the density of social relationships are all indicators are all very closely correlated with the number of children and families in the community. And this is what's happened to the children in Somerville. These figures, you can see from 1985 to this current school year. These are measured in January of each year. These are the children in these are the children wherever in any school anywhere. I mean, if a child is whose residence is in Somerville is going to a school in Phoenix, Arizona, they are included in this number. So this is a good estimate of the total children in Somerville. So returning to housing, to that thread, we can see how much the issue of housing is affected by all the other elements of the system that is Somerville. So what happens is because there aren't enough living wage jobs in Somerville, there are a lot of people who can't live here and make a living sufficient to pay the rent here. The tax base doesn't produce enough income to pay for affordable housing, for the development of new affordable housing. And because we don't have sufficient revenue from commercial development, increasing tax rates on residents increasingly burden those residents. So homeowners are either selling out or just getting disgusted with because the city is so different from the one they grew up in. And when they sell their homes, the people who buy the homes naturally look for the highest possible return so they can service their mortgage debt. And the tenants who can't pay are evicted. And whatever else that we've been doing in terms of housing policy thus far, these dynamics that I've just described dominate those policies. And a lot of us haven't been paying attention to that because it's been somewhat masked, in part by the 2.5 limit, in part by condominium conversions, and in part because one-time building fees, for example, in Union Square or Boynton Yards, help us limp through the next budget season. But we can't keep doing this. Now, it's not all doom. My presentation is not all doom and gloom because we have an enormous upsurge right now in new commercial development. And a lot of that is concentrated in the life sciences sector, which is a huge benefit for us. So Stephen will remember that I've been advocating for 25 years for more commercial development and the last 10 for lab space, and it's finally happening. And it seems to be happening if we only look at this historical moment at a furious pace. In one of these Somerville Turning 21 presentations, George Parakis listed about 9 or 10 new developments. And I was thinking about putting that on the presentation, but it's too much to absorb in one screen. So a lot of us, are thinking, hey, this is great. Our problem is solved. Well, now we have a new problem. And that problem was revealed last March in a very little noticed memo that Rich Raish, who's the director of infrastructure and asset management, sent to the city council. And it got a kind of brief notice in the budget hearing. But I don't know any, excuse me, I don't know any of our elected leaders right now who really have their arms around this. And I'll come back to that in a moment. It's not being discussed at all in this election, but it is a very, very serious for our future. For generations, Somerville's kind of kicked the infrastructure can down the road in favor of investments and expenditures that are more politically popular. And at the end of the presentation, Stephen is going to tell us how we can access this report, because I tried to go back and find it online. I have it on my computer, but I can't find it online. But I would encourage all of you to give it a serious read, especially the first 3 pages. The report opens with him saying that every class of our infrastructure is approaching the end of its useful life. And then he takes each one and details it. And this table that's on the screen now attempts to summarize what he has to say. And I'm going to walk you through it. Let's start with the columns. The first is a type of infrastructure, as you know, as he distinguishes it. The second is the condition, and the condition refers to its physical integrity, or to put it another way, how close it is to failing. The configuration is how well it meets the current needs of the city. So a horse and buggy, for example, could be in great condition, but it's not very useful on a expressway. The cost, the figures where the dollar figures appear is assuming that we don't do anything about the configuration. We just leave it as it is. What is it going to do to prevent failure? What do we need to spend to prevent failure and to bring our, to bring our infrastructure up to code requirements and regulatory requirements? And the third, he doesn't really attempt to, the third would be the third column, the next column was, well, if we really did want infrastructure that meets our needs, what would that cost? And his report doesn't attempt, with the possible exception of water distribution, which I'll get to, doesn't attempt to estimate those costs. So going through each class, buildings, he said, most of our buildings are in quite poor condition, except for the newer schools. Of the 300 million that it would cost simply to make emergency repair, of 300 million it would cost to bring it into nominal condition, 100 million is simply to make emergency repairs, simply to prevent catastrophic failures. Pavement and sidewalks, most of you know because you drive Somerville streets. More than half the streets, Rich estimates, and by the way, his estimates are based on the other members of his department who were engineers and so on. It would cost 220 million. And he says that more than half the streets would require full reconstruction. And beyond that, another 30% of our streets and roads would require extensive maintenance just to prevent the need for full reconstruction. If we move over to configuration, I used the word deficient because he didn't use a word. But what he explained was that in this memo, what he explained is that right now we're kind of at the beginning of a mobility revolution. And simply to sustain our economic development, we need a new construction configuration of our transportation infrastructure. And also, frankly, to take notice of climate change, we need to adjust some of our transportation infrastructure. And that is, he doesn't even attempt to estimate the cost of that. Sewer and stormwater, you all probably know just how desperate that infrastructure category is. Our sewer system was built in the 1800s. I'm sorry, by the 1880s. About half of it was built before 1900, and almost all of the other half was built before 1920. And it's falling apart. And the 100 million just assumes, with the current configuration, just assumes that we don't have catastrophic failure the way the system is currently configured. But the problem is that the current configuration does not separate sanitary sewerage from stormwater drainage. And that is, well, I'll say this, the MWRA has an administrative order on it because Somerville's sewers aren't separated. And many people, particularly those in Ward 2, discover this about once every 4 years when the floods push poo-poo up into their basements. His estimate of 100 million, once again, speaks not at all to the necessity of separating the two systems. And finally, water distribution. I put uncertain in this category, not because Rich was necessarily uncertain, but because I was uncertain reading his report. But I can say that he says that we need to spend 500 million over the next 50 years. Now, I don't know if that's, and I'm going to assume that that's for both condition and configuration. As I said earlier, most of the politicians, most of our elected leaders are either totally unaware of it or have only glanced at this. And the few who seem to have noticed this have drawn false conclusions from it. And the false conclusions are, first of all, if you add up the numbers that we have, the column that we have numbers for, comes for about 1.1 billion. To give you a sense of the scale of that, our total bonded debt right now, well, as of the last available comprehensive CAFR, comprehensive annual financial reports for the city, which was fiscal year 2020, our total bonded debt was 245 million. So this is 4 times all the bonded debt that we have right now, which if we wanted to tax homeowners even if we wanted to tax homeowners into extinction, we wouldn't be able to pay to bond that much debt, in part because we couldn't tax because of Prop 2.5, and in part because our bond rating would go through the floor. Yet that figure, 1.1 billion, does not include what we need to really get our infrastructure into optimal condition. To give you an example of optimal condition, going back to the city buildings category, the city buildings that we have now where our employees work undermine their productivity and their functionality. The Riches Department did a rating a few years ago for each city department's space in which they work and to what extent it was functional. 60% on a scale of 1 to 5, 60% were 2.5 or below. So the lack of good infrastructure to house our employees is also undermining their productivity. I'm almost done here. Oh, yeah. So I'll just say, I think I did say, the true bill that we're anticipating for infrastructure is substantially larger than 1.1 billion. And no one at the level of city leadership or any of the almost any of the candidates in the current election are discussing that or anticipating that. But it may very well be the thing that most defines anything else that we want to do, because anything else that we want to do, we have to pay for. So we're almost done here. As one person who is nowhere near the smartest person in the city, but I do try and pay attention to the data that are available. This is what I would recommend for policymakers to consider. First of all, let's start thinking systemically about our city. Trying to push too hard on any one piece on the chessboard is going to upset the other pieces. Secondly, I think I missed a slide here. I did miss a slide. I'm sorry. So let me say, the boon that we are seeing right now in the development of new commercial property, and particularly in lab space, has a couple of obstacles in its way. One is that we're discovering that the so-called transformative areas don't have the development capacity that we imagined, because they don't have this transportation infrastructure to sustain that development. I'll give you one example. Boynton Yards, the one exception to that, by the way, is Assembly Square. The other 4 development areas, that the city identified as transformative areas in its comprehensive plans, are Union Square, Boynton Yards, Innerbelt, and Brick Bottom. To give you the example of Boynton Yards, simply to enable to get the people who work in commercial buildings in and out of Boynton Yards, the city imposed a 1,500 parking space limit. And DLJ's development already is absorbed 1,200 of those parking spaces. They want another 300. And the majority of Boynton Yards is still not redeveloped. The Nissenbaum property, for example, which is the largest collection of parcels there, when they put that property on the market earlier this year, they got something like about 100 developers interested. And when those developers discovered the parking limitations, they've all gone away except for DLJ. So what's happening is the market value of the properties surrounding DLJ's development are plummeting. And by the way, I don't want to badmouth DLJ, because in comparison to, say, USQ, they have been saints in terms of trying to respond to community needs. What I'm trying to describe isn't the virtues of a particular developer, but the realities of our city as a system. I'm getting there, Steve. Next point, I was so what happened? But the second kind of obstacle that I see is life sciences now is a land rush, and we're looking at the potential for the market to become saturated. Every developer in the world now who has the capacity to do it wants to build lab space. And we were able to succeed because of our proximity to the densest innovation district on the planet because of our workforce. And but so what do we do next? And I think what we do next is that we promote Somerville as a center for environmental technology. And we still have that workforce, but we also have Greentown Labs. We have Summer Nova, which are producing startup and emerging technology companies. And now we need to expand the ecological niche for those companies when they grow so that they don't lose the city. They don't leave the city, as so many companies like iRobot, for example, have done in the past. But I think that, again, Somerville can have just as much success as an environmental technology center as it has now in a biotech center, if we get really smart about the items that I put on here. Next, I think we need to preserve all land, as much land as we can for commercial development. And I would say more, but if there's any time for the Q&A, I will. There are certain key blocks in the city that I think should be commercial only because they are proximate. People who study such things find that humans are willing to walk further to a transit node from their homes than they are willing to walk from a transit node to their jobs. Their difference is about a quarter mile versus half a mile. I mean, there are certain places in the city where I think we should just not allow more residential development. I'm going to give you an example of, let's say, Somerville Avenue between the heart of Union Square and the Market Basket. And so I think those blocks should be zoned from going forward commercial only. In order to increase the capacity for the 4 transformative districts that I've owned to sustain more development, I think we need bus rapid transit that would serve them. And the city's mobility management department is having conversations with MBTA and Cambridge and Boston regarding that. And then we need to make sure that all the people who live in Somerville who need those jobs can get them, both through training and through priority placement. And finally, there's a big conversation going on about tall buildings. Well, frankly, the taller the buildings that we build, the more open space we can pay for, and the more open space we leave. And I'll leave it at there. And try and do I turn this back to you, Stephen?
Yes, I think you can leave you can keep the host right now.
Okay.
What I will do is I will, because some people might want to refer to parts of your presentation, which was, in my opinion, outstanding. And I thank you very much. I thought what we would do now is we take a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes for Q&A for the official part. And then I'll be keeping, then we'll be at 1 hour. We can stay on, Bill, if you would be so kind as to hang out for a while and we can have an informal discussion after. But I wanted to give people an opportunity. I'm sure they've been eager some people to ask questions. Is there anybody who would like to go first?
I would. Can you hear me?
Yes, could you please identify yourself and go ahead with your question?
Yes, my name is Judy Jacobs, and I'm a homeowner and a landlord. And my family's been here a very long time, since 1930. So we're in our 4th generation right now. I worked at Tufts and MIT, so I know a little bit about what Bill's talking about. Hi, Bill. Great
Hi,
presentation
hi
as
Judy,
always.
thank you.
Hi, we miss you. Are you still writing for Somerville Times?
I have a column in today's,
Oh, great. Oh,
yeah,
great. Okay. I'll
okay.
look for that, Bill. I have a question for you regarding the life and sciences. Do you actually know the specifics on how this works with the colleges? I mean, are they, because they're nonprofit status, are they contributing, say for rental and what are they giving back to the city? I'm just curious about that. Do you know that answer?
What I heard, I think, was two questions. One was about payment in lieu of taxes, and it's
Okay,
pretty close to zero. We don't get much from Tufts in terms of money.
right.
And that's the only real college that we have in Somerville. The other was, and maybe I'm misinterpreting, was how do the people who need the jobs get training for life sciences? And the answer to that, there's two answers. One, Somerville has one of the best, what we used to call vocational education schools in the country. I mean, in the Massachusetts, and you, they are working on and developing training for lab techs. There already exists training from a nonprofit in Cambridge called Just to Start. They've been doing that for 10 or 20 years. But something like 10% of all of the people who work in life sciences don't even have associate's degrees. And yet lab techs can get, $50,000-$60,000 a year. So this is something that we need to pursue for our people in Somerville who need it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a little
Eh,
different than what I thought. I was
eh,
wondering if MIT was actually going to occupy some space in Union Square due to its proximity and the relationship they have with the city. I also just wanted to mention about the sewer system. I actually was affected by this problem. I'm glad you shared those figures. I was told by a former alderman that it would be 3 billion for
Yeah.
our sewer and our water, but I don't know. He probably was
Th-
exaggerating. I mean, who really knows
eh,
that answer, right?
that-
So,
Thank you,
okay, all right.
thank you very
Yeah,
much,
thank you
Judy.
for answering. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good presentation.
Thank you, Judy. Anybody else, if you want to raise your hand or just open your microphone?
God, sorry to overwhelm everyone.
Oh,
There's a lot
but-
to take
but-
in. Steve, before I go, I'm actually going to go now, but I wanted to ask you if this information will be made available to
Yeah, you'll
anyone.
all, I'll
Okay,
send everybody on this an email
all right,
with
terrific.
further
All right.
information.
I
Thank you,
hope to
Judy.
hear from you again, Bill. Thanks,
Thank
Steve,
you.
so
Thank you,
much.
Susie.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Wig Zamor.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks a lot, Bill. We share some common knowledge in some of the stuff you presented, but I have a question about sewer and water separation. All of the old cities in Eastern Massachusetts have that same problem. And what percent of the cities and towns that are at median income or below do you think are going to be able to foot that bill themselves as opposed to relying on regional funding as they have in the past with MWRA?
I have no idea. I know that in the current election, I've inserted a couple of questions into the various forums about this particular question and how we pay for it. And those candidates who do respond simply cite the infrastructure bill that President Biden is proposing as one possibility. But as you point out, Wig, I think that the problem is such a mass that that's not going to take us very far.
Yeah, and just, one more small comment on that. Cities like Cambridge can and have paid for their own systems, and they're completely separate. They decided to, have a completely separate sewer and water system, use their own reservoir, But other cities like Boston contribute very, very little relative to what they get from the state agency. And I guess, one conclusion that might be discussed would be whether working with other municipalities in the same situation through MWRA in the state might not be a smarter thing to do than to face it yourself.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Wick. Is there any, Adam Portney?
Hey, Bill, thanks for putting this on. So I just have a question. A lot of the things that you bring up seem to be regional issues. The housing, the lack of the commercial percentages to pay for everything that we need, the failing infrastructure. All of these things are regional issues that cannot be controlled, in my opinion, by a 4 square mile city in the middle of that region. And because we don't have these Chinese walls like you're talking about, anything that we do here flushes out or comes in, whichever way you want to do it, with the rest of the region. And therefore, any actions that we take are quickly dissipated throughout the region because other people are able to take advantage of it. And we're not just protecting the people who are currently in Somerville. So I'm wondering, because of our high density in Somerville and our population, if more should be done, pushed on a regional or statewide level to help Somerville and the region. And therefore, instead of just looking at what Somerville can do internally, because I think if we just focus on Somerville, which is what everyone continues to do, we're not going to solve the problems of housing inequality. We're not going to solve the problems of the inequities all across this region that we're facing, and or the infrastructure problems. And I think by focusing in on this very small area, we are never going to solve the regional issue. Even if we were to solve the problems in Somerville somehow with a magic tree of money, it would still just be dissipated throughout the region. It wouldn't be enough. So what are your thoughts on solving this regionally instead of just internally in Somerville?
Well, I couldn't agree more with your diagnosis. I think you're exactly right. As I mentioned in the earlier,
Okay, well, you can stop there.
as I mentioned in the introduction, I kind of view it as that we're like the middle Petrushka doll in a series of a dozen, Russian dolls, and we can only, to the extent that we have any control, we can exert some on the ones that are inside, but not on the ones that in which we are nested. And I don't have an answer, and neither do our elected representatives. Our senator and our state reps are all deeply frustrated because they feel like the leadership in both houses is immovable, and no matter how urgent or important the problems are, they can't seem to get any traction. So precisely because of your diagnosis, I tried to focus this on what is it that we can do. And, all systems, going back to the analogy of the chess pieces and the rubber bands, some rubber bands are stronger than others. And pretty much throughout human history, the strongest rubber band has been economic. Before we write poetry or build buildings, we have to eat, and we have to develop a system for providing for our material needs, and that is what an economy is. And it's no different in Somerville. Yeah, I'm going to wax a little bit here. The single most influential element in Somerville's system happens to be commercial development, because it generates the revenue by which we pay for everything else. And too many of our politicians and cities leaders don't appreciate the fact that all of the work that a city does, all the work that nonprofits do, are created by businesses. That is to say, the revenue to pay for that work is created by business. I've been a socialist for 50 years, but I live in a capitalist society. And socialism emerged from very, very detailed analysis of systems and the data that support that analysis. And what's happened now too often is many of our political candidates are substituting ideology for evidence and tribalism for community, and don't recognize that without a vibrant business community, we don't have a future.
I think that's a solid statement from a socialist. And I do think, just to follow up on that socialist comment, that it's easy to punch within your own bubble than to leave your bubble and point the fingers at the real problems. And I think that can be seen in Somerville as well as the rest of the country. Because while the commercial engine that fuels the projects that everyone needs throughout the state and across the country are in these small bubbles, we also, we need to force, a greater social safety net under everybody. And that happens to create, where the populations are, more money goes to that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think what we'll do now, we're coming up on an hour. We're going to say there's time for one more formal question on the recording. And then what we're going to do is we're going to end the formal part of this hour. And anybody who would like to hang on and have an informal chat is welcome to do so. But is there another question from anybody in the audience? Is that Mr. Nissenbaum?
Hi, thank you. I think everyone should listen and see what type of person we have in Somerville. Bill is just a great, great person, not just for Somerville, but he is for Somerville that he stayed not in California, but he came east. And what Bill had to say is something that is really, really great. What he said is just the start of something is new. I want to tell the group that 8 months ago, I started a program for the school in Somerville, all schools in Somerville. Basically, I said it will go from kindergarten to 12th year. And people that know about this said that's probably something we cannot start and do in the period of time that we'll have in the dollars. We'll have to change everything. So unfortunately, we have not had another meeting, but there's a meeting I'm having with some people on this Thursday night to start this program. Through the Nissenbaum group, we're going to give a small amount of money to the school department. It's $1 million to change things in Somerville so that when children go to kindergarten, by the time 12 years comes and we have to have the teachers and the classes and everyone put together decision of where this child should go. If it wants to go here, if it wants to go higher. The other thing is we have someone that lives right here in Somerville, knows about automobiles. And he works for one of the German companies. I can't tell you his name, but the point is that in 3 to 5 years, there's going to be the real electric cars. There's a new battery that's just now coming on the market that's nothing like the ones that Toyota has or other people. And there'll be other people that will have the driverless, don't have cars that are not driving. They'll have cars where the majority of people in Somerville, Cambridge, and Boston, they're going to lease the car. So they're not gonna leave the car in Somerville. It's gonna go back to wherever the ground area is for it to stay. And then when it's called in, someone else will just get that car from the, punch it in your computer where you are. I'm in Cambridge and I need to go to part of Somerville. They'll just be able to do it. We have to remember that that's going to happen not just in Somerville, not just in the East. That's going to happen in all of the United States and other parts of Europe. So there's going to be major, major changes, both in how children should be taught and how they should reach that through their families and other people. So that's just a start. And as I start this small group that's going to start on Wednesday to move forward, we hope that we can get this ready to start for next year's school system to start this program. I've already spoken to the superintendent and mayor, so this is not a secret to people that, the only reason it's a secret is because of the 7 months of the disease we've had in this country. Things have had to stop, but I hope that that'll get a lot better too, so we can continue. This is just basically batting practice for this week, but next time I see you, maybe we're going to have something that you won't believe. It's going to be really great. Maybe I could just have Bill get involved with it too. He might know. I've talked to Bill a lot about this. And if he helps us move forward, and other people that live here in the community or close to our community, that know what it takes to have this be great. And so that in years to come, people want to move into Somerville, and also possibly there'll be all kinds of jobs that will be available for them soon that will make, I've already been saying, in 20 years, you won't recognize, where we are now and Union Square. It's going to be completely different, and people are really going to love it. That's all I had to say.
Thank you very much. That's a great comment, and we'll look forward to working together
Thank you.
on that. Thank you. With that, I think we're going to conclude the formal section, and we'll continue on. We may see. I want to thank Bill Sheldon and all of you for being here and joining. Next week, we will have the current president of the City Council, Matt McLaughlin, next Tuesday at noon.